Feed my pregnant she-wolf, the dying man told the widow, his voice barely more than a hoarse whisper against the night wind, blood and mud staining a coat too fine for the lowlands. I ask nothing for myself, only for her.
Only for her.
He did not give his name. He did not explain the silver-furred creature collapsed beside him, her rounded belly trembling with each labored breath, nor the weight behind his eyes. Ilyara Vansk had buried her husband 3 seasons past, and with him, everything soft she had once believed about herself. Estranged from her clan, called broken in whispers, sent to live where no one had to face her failure twice, she had learned to expect nothing from strangers, and to offer nothing either. It was safer that way, quieter, a grief small enough to carry alone. She could have said no. She could have closed the door on the wounded stranger and his pregnant she-wolf, gone back to her fire, her solitude. But something in the way the wolf leaned, weak, against the dying man's hand. Something in the exhaustion behind his eyes that mirrored her own too closely to ignore, made the door swing wider instead of shut. She did not know that night that she was letting a king into her home. She only knew that some doors, once opened, are never truly closed again, and that hers was about to change everything. You love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists? Go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The clan hall smelled of torch smoke and melted wax, a smell Ilyara felt cling to her throat every time she had to cross that space. The high beams seemed to lean over her, as if the ceiling itself wanted to witness her shame once again. It was the widow's assembly, the ritual she hated and still had to endure once every season. Presenting herself before the council of elders to prove she remained alone, without an heir, without purpose. She felt the weight of the stairs before she even lifted her face. Rows of familiar faces, neighbors who had once been kind, now watching her like one watches a broken piece waiting to be discarded. Ilyara Vansk, called Elder Doran, his voice echoing cold through the hall. 3 seasons have passed since your mate's death. No child. No sign that the moon goddess has granted you the blessing of lineage. A murmur rippled through the hall like wind through dry leaves. Ilyara kept her chin raised, but her hands, hidden in the folds of her plain dress, trembled. She felt cold sweat trickle down her neck, her heart pounding so hard she feared everyone could hear it. I know what I am in the eyes of this council, she said, her voice steadier than she felt inside. I don't need reminding. And yet you insist on remaining on clan lands, occupying space that could be given to a family that actually grows, the elder continued, without mercy. Perhaps it's time to accept the lowlands. There, at least, you won't be in plain sight as a reminder of what's missing. The words struck her like stones. Ilyara felt her face burn, shame climbing up her neck to her ears. She wanted to scream that she had loved, that she had tried, that the pain of burying a husband wasn't her fault. But she knew no words would change the verdict already whispered in every gaze around her. It was then, in the middle of that heavy silence, that she made the decision that would change her life without anyone in the hall suspecting it. Then I will go, she said, and her own voice surprised her with its calm. I will leave for the lowlands before the sun sets tomorrow. A faint murmur of surprise passed through the crowd. Ilyara waited for no reaction. She turned and walked out of the hall, each step echoing louder than she would have liked, the weight of her dress feeling like shackles around her ankles. Only when the cool night air touched her face, once outside, did she allow her shoulders to drop, the air trapped in her chest escaping in a trembling sigh. The tears came then, silent, and she let them fall without trying to hold them back, because there, in the darkness, no one else needed to see her strong. 2 weeks passed before Ilyara truly settled into her new cabin in the lowlands. where the village ended and the forest began reclaiming its territory. The house was small, with a roof that creaked when it rained hard, and an herb garden she tended with the care of someone who had nothing else left to care for. There, at least, the silence didn't hurt. It was a chosen silence, not an imposed one. That particular night, the wind blew differently. It carried a scent that didn't belong to that part of the forest. Metal, sweat, something that stirred an old, almost animal alertness in her, even without the gift of shifting that other wolves possessed. Ilyara moved closer to the window, her fingers pulling the thin curtain back just enough to peer into the darkness. Nothing. Just shadows between the trees, swaying with the wind. She was about to turn back to the stove, where soup simmered slowly, when she heard it. Footsteps, dragging, uneven, as if every movement cost too high a price. And then, a deeper sound, a low groan, almost muffled, that wasn't human. Ilyara's heart raced. She grabbed the wooden spoon she used for stirring her soup, holding it with more determination than confidence, and walked to the door. When she opened it, the air left her lungs. A man lay slumped against the doorframe, his face marked with cuts that were already beginning to close in a strange way, too fast to be ordinary wounds. His clothes, though torn and caked with mud, bore embroidery she had never seen before, silver threads woven together as if telling a story she couldn't read. His eyes, meeting hers, held something Ilyara recognized instantly, because she had felt it in herself before, an exhaustion that went beyond the body, a weariness that lived in the soul. Beside him, stretched out on the damp earth, an enormous wolf breathed with difficulty, her silver fur caked with mud, her belly visibly rounded beneath the faint moonlight. "Please!" The man's voice came out hoarse, broken, as if every word cost a piece of strength he no longer had to spare. "I ask nothing for myself, but her... She cannot lose what she carries." Ilyara felt her instincts scream at her to close the door, lock herself inside, and pretend she'd never seen any of it. But there was something in that man's eyes, and especially in the way the wolf beside him tried, even weak, to move closer to him as if wanting to protect him, that made Ilyara's chest tighten in a way she couldn't name. "Come in," she said, stepping back from the door, the spoon forgotten in her hand. "Quickly, before anyone else sees you." She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he was, where he came from, or why a wolf carried such a precious belly beside him. She only knew that night, her small cabin in the lowlands had stopped being an exile. It had become a refuge, and she had no idea yet how much that decision would cost her, nor how much she would gain from it. Ilyara didn't sleep that night. She sat by the hearth with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the stranger she'd carried inside. Half dragged, really, since he'd nearly folded in on himself the moment he crossed her threshold. Breathe against the cot she'd cleared of blankets and old baskets just an hour before. The wolf, Saval, lay curled near the fire, her silver flank rising and falling in a rhythm Ilyara had learned to count without meaning to, the way you count something you're afraid might stop. By the time the sun cracked pale gold through the shutters, the man's wounds had closed enough that Ilyara no longer feared he'd bleed out on her floor. What she feared now was simpler, and somehow worse. She had absolutely no idea what to do with a half-dead stranger and a very pregnant wolf who watched her every movement with eyes far too intelligent for an ordinary animal. "You're staring," Ilyara muttered, ladling broth into a chipped bowl. "I know you understand me. Don't think I haven't noticed." Saval's ears twitched. If a wolf could look amused, Ilyara would have sworn that's exactly what was happening. "Great," Ilyara sighed. "Even the wolf thinks I'm ridiculous." "She doesn't think that," came a low, rasping voice from the cot. "She thinks you talk too much before breakfast. So do I, honestly, but I'm too polite to say it twice." Ilyara nearly dropped the bowl. The stranger was pushing himself upright, wincing, one hand braced against the wall like the wall had personally wronged him. "You shouldn't be sitting up," she said. crossing the room faster than she meant to. You shouldn't be talking to wildlife like it owes you rent, and yet here we are. His mouth curved, just barely, at the corner, the ghost of a smile that looked unused to being there. I'm Rarek. Just Rarek? For now, just Rarek. Something flickered behind his eyes, quick and guarded, gone before she could name it. And that is Savil. She'd thank you herself if she had the vocabulary for it. She's making do with the staring. She's very good at it. She's had centuries to practice. Ilyara paused, the bowl halfway to his hands. Centuries. Figure of speech, Rarek said smoothly, far too smoothly, and took the broth before she could ask anything else. She let it go. Barely. She had learned in 3 seasons of widowhood that some doors were better left shut until you were ready for what walked through them. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Ilyara hadn't expected and wasn't sure she wanted to examine too closely. Rarek healed faster than any person she'd ever tended, bruises fading in a day, cuts closing in hours. But he hid the strangeness of it behind complaints so ordinary she nearly forgot to be suspicious. This tea, he announced on the 3rd morning, holding the cup like it had personally insulted his bloodline, tastes like a field lost a fight to a puddle. It's for the swelling in your ribs. My ribs would rather stay swollen. Your ribs don't get a vote. He looked at her then, something startled crossing his face, as though no one had spoken to him that way in longer than he cared to admit. Then he laughed. A real laugh, rough from disuse, like a door hinge finally getting oil after years of rust. You're terrifying, he said. Truly. I've faced down men twice my size who flinched less than I just did. I doubt that very much. You'd be surprised what a strong opinion about tea can do to a man's composure. Ilyara fought the smile trying to climb her face and lost badly. Across the room, Sava let out a low huff that sounded suspiciously like a laugh of her own and swatted her tail against the floorboards twice, as if scoring the exchange. Even she agrees, Ilyara said. You're impossible. She agrees that the tea is terrible. Don't put words in the wolf's mouth. She's not exactly correcting me. She's diplomatic, unlike you. It went on like that, small barbs traded across breakfast, over the mending of his torn coat, during the long afternoons when he sat by the window pretending not to watch the road for danger, and failing at pretending. Ilyara found herself, against every instinct honed by loss, looking forward to it. To him. To the ridiculous, sharp-tongued man who flinched at bitter tea, but had barely flinched, she suspected, at whatever violence had put those wounds on his body in the first place. She noticed things she didn't want to notice. The way his jaw tightened when he thought she wasn't looking, some private grief passing behind his eyes before he smoothed it back into wit. The way his hand hovered near Savil's flank sometimes, protective, almost reverent, like the wolf was something infinitely more fragile than her size suggested. Despite the fact that Savil, even weakened, was easily the size of a small horse and radiated a quiet, ancient dignity that made Ilyara's skin prickle every time their eyes met. She's not just a wolf, is she? Ilyara said one evening, not quite a question, as she changed the dressing on Rarek's shoulder. He went very still. No, he admitted finally. She isn't. Are you going to tell me what she is? Are you going to let me finish this bandage in peace if I don't? No. He huffed. The same huff Savil made, Ilyara realized with a start, like the two of them had picked up each other's habits over years she couldn't guess the length of. She's family, he said, quieter now, the humor draining into something rawer. The kind you don't choose and wouldn't trade for anything you could. What she carries, it isn't just important to me. It's important to more people than I can protect right now. That's why we're here. That's why I can't tell you everything. Not because I don't trust you, but because the less you carry, the safer you are. Ilyara sat back on her heels, studying him. There was no performance in his face now, none of the easy sharpness he wore like armor, just exhaustion, and underneath it, something that looked almost like guilt. "You didn't have to bring danger to my door," she said softly. "You could have kept walking." "I know." His eyes met hers, steady despite everything. "I did it anyway. I'm not sorry, and I should be, and I find I can't manage it." A beat. "You make it very difficult to regret things, Ilyara Vansk." Her name in his mouth landed somewhere low in her chest, warm and unwelcome and entirely too pleasant. "You don't even know me," she said, though it came out softer than she meant it to. "I know you fed a stranger and a wolf without asking a single useful question. I know you argue about tea like it's a matter of state. I know Savil, who trusts almost no one, fell asleep at your feet on the second night like she'd known you her whole life." He tilted his head, and that almost smile returned, gentler now. "I know enough to think I got remarkably lucky, whoever's door I stumbled to." Savil, from her spot by the fire, let out a long, satisfied sigh, as if she'd been waiting for him to say precisely that. "Oh, be quiet," Ilyara told her, cheeks warm, and Savil's tail thumped twice against the floor in cheerful betrayal. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the first cold breath of the coming season through the cracks in the shutters, and somewhere far beyond the tree line, in a castle Ilyara had never seen and couldn't yet imagine, a man with ambition sharp as a blade was already asking his spies a single, patient question. Where did the king disappear to? But inside the small cabin in the lowlands, for one more night, laughter outran fear. 2 days' ride from the lowlands, in a castle that had not stopped mourning since the accident, Cassian Morwen stood at the window of the council chamber and told himself, for the 100th time, that grief looked exactly like this. It had to. He had rehearsed it enough. "The search parties found nothing past the ravine," said one of the guards behind him, voice hollow with exhaustion. "The carriage wheel snapped clean. Whoever inspected it before the journey should be questioned." "I inspected it myself," Cassian said, and it wasn't even a lie, which was the strange, hollow joke of it all. He had inspected it. He had simply made sure it would fail. "I'll carry that mistake the rest of my life." The guard bowed his head, murmuring something about how no one could have known, and left Cassian alone with the window and the gray sky and the coronation robes already being quietly measured in a back room he wasn't supposed to know about. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt the same way he'd felt as a boy of 10, standing outside Rarik's door after the old king denied him something small and unimportant, hungry for a thing he couldn't name, and furious that hunger made him feel so small. "You were supposed to be the second son I never had," the old king used to say to him. "Rarik needs someone to keep him honest." Cassian had spent 30 years keeping Rarik honest and watched every honor, every title, every ounce of the realm's love pour into his friend like water, finding the lowest point, while he stood at the edge holding an empty cup. It wasn't hatred exactly that had led him to the carriage wheel. He almost wished it were. Hatred would have been simpler to live with than this itch of why not me, worn smooth from decades of handling. "My lord." Bren's voice, careful and even, pulled him from the window. The old steward stood in the doorway, hands folded, face schooled into the same grief-blank mask everyone else in the castle wore. "The council wishes to discuss the regency." "Let them discuss," Cassian said. "I'll join shortly." Bren didn't move. For half a breath too long, his eyes held Cassian's, and something passed through them. Not suspicion exactly. Cassian would have caught suspicion, but a kind of steady, patient watching that made the back of Cassian's neck prickle. "Something else, Bren?" "Only that His Majesty always said you were the sharpest mind in this castle." Bren's voice was mild as milk. "I imagine that sharpness will serve the regency well. Grief clouds lesser men. I doubt it'll cloud you. He bowed and left before Cassian could decide whether he'd just been complimented or gutted. Later that night, alone in his chambers, Cassian poured himself wine he didn't taste and stared at the small portrait on his desk. Himself and Rarik as boys, arms slung around each other's shoulders, gap-toothed and sunburned from a summer neither of them had known would be one of the last easy ones. He remembered that day. Rarik had given him his own share of honeycomb, because Cassian's had fallen in the dirt, no ceremony to it, no debt implied. Just a boy handing another boy something good because he had it to give. Cassian's hand tightened around the cup until his knuckles paled. You always gave things away like they cost you nothing, he murmured to the portrait, and hated how much his voice shook. Did you ever wonder what it cost me, watching? He didn't finish the wine. He set it down, and for one unguarded moment, something that looked almost like grief, real grief, not the performed kind, crossed his face before he shut it away like a door slamming on a draft. Whatever he'd done, whatever he told himself about deserving, some small, stubborn part of him still ached like a boy who'd lost his oldest friend. He drowned that part quickly. It was easier that way. Back in the lowlands, the lightness of the morning made the castle and its schemes feel like something from a different world entirely. Absolutely not, Ilyara said, arms crossed, watching Rarik attempt, badly, to help her mend the fence along the herb garden. You're going to lose a finger. I have survived considerably worse than a fence. You nearly lost to a teacup 3 days ago. That tea was an act of aggression and you know it. He wrestled with the post, which wobbled with the enthusiasm of something actively trying to embarrass him. He caught himself. I have led men into difficult places. I can manage a fence. Uh-huh. Ilyara took the mallet gently from his hands before he could do something they'd both regret. Sit. Watch. Learn from someone who has never once lost a fence-related duel. You're enjoying this? Immensely. He sat, wincing slightly at the pull in his healing ribs, and watched her work with the kind of attention that made her hands slightly unsteady on the post, though she'd never admit that to him in this lifetime. Savel lay nearby in a patch of sun, watching them both with the lazy, satisfied air of someone who considered this entire scene her personal achievement. She looks smug, Ilyara noted. She's always smug. It's her natural state. Smug and pregnant and entirely too pleased with herself. But his voice, when he looked at Savel, went soft in a way it never did when he spoke to anyone else. Soft, the way you speak about something you've carried through fire. She's the only family I have left who still looks at me like I haven't disappointed her. Ilyara set the mallet down. I doubt that's true. You'd be surprised. He looked at his hands. There was someone I trusted like a brother once. I would have given him anything he asked for. I think, somewhere along the way, that became the problem. He shook his head, like shaking off a chill. Forgive me. I didn't mean to bring the whole sky down on a Tuesday. You can bring the sky down whenever you want, Ilyara said quietly. I've had my own storms in this house. It's not so crowded that yours can't join. He looked up at her then, and whatever guard he usually kept, sharp wit, easy deflection, dropped entirely, just for a moment, leaving something achingly open in its place. You keep doing that, he said. Doing what? Making it easy to say true things. He huffed a short laugh, disbelieving of himself. I forgot I could do that. Say true things. It's been a long while. The wind moved through the garden, carrying the smell of turned earth and drying herbs, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, the silence comfortable in a way silence with him had stopped being awkward days ago. Savel let out a low, pleased rumble from her spot in the sun, tail thumping twice, and Ilyara found herself laughing before she could stop it. She's rooting for something, Ilyara said. She's rooting for everything constantly. It's exhausting being related to her. I think it's sweet. You would. But he was smiling, really smiling. The guarded sharpness melted clean off his face. And Ilyara felt something in her chest turn over, warm and frightening in equal measure. The way you feel stepping onto ice you're not sure will hold. She didn't know his kingdom. She didn't know his real name in full, or the shape of the danger circling behind him, or that a man 2 days' ride away was rehearsing grief in a mirror while wearing another man's future like a borrowed coat. She only knew that laughter had found her small, quiet house in the lowlands, and that some deep, long-starved part of her had started cautiously to hope again. And that hope, she was beginning to suspect, might be the most dangerous thing Rarik had brought to her door. The rain came hard that night, the kind that turned the path outside into a river of mud and drummed against the roof like something trying to get in. Ilyara had lit every candle she owned, less for the light than for the company of the flame, and was losing, badly, at a card game Rarik had invented on the spot, and refused to admit he was making up as he went. "That is not a rule," she said, watching him slide a card triumphantly onto the table. "It is absolutely a rule. You just said it." "I said it with authority. That's how rules are made." He leaned back, entirely too pleased with himself, and Savel, sprawled across the hearth rug with her enormous head resting on her paws, let out a low huff that Ilyara had come to recognize, after 2 weeks, as a laugh. "She's laughing at you," Ilyara said. "She's laughing at you. You're the one who keeps losing to rules I invent. Because you invent new ones every time I'm about to win. A king has to protect his interests." The word slipped out easy, careless, and he caught it a half-second too late. She watched it happen, watched the flicker of alarm cross his face before he covered it with a cough and reached for his cup. A king of cards. This particular game. I have declared myself sovereign of it." Ilyara arched a brow, letting the moment stretch just long enough to watch him squirm, delighting in it more than she probably should have. "Uh-huh. You're not going to let that go, are you? Not even a little. Wonderful." He dragged a hand down his face, and beneath the embarrassment, something like relief flickered. Relief that she'd chosen to tease rather than press. She noticed it. She was starting to notice a great many things about him, small tells that mapped a man far more careful, far more guarded than his easy humor let on. "Fine, yes, I have delusions of grandeur. Comes with certain circles I used to run in. Circles. Very fancy circles. Excellent snacks. Terrible company." Ilyara laughed. Really laughed. The kind that came up from her chest before she could soften it into something more ladylike. And the sound seemed to startle him, the way it always did, like he hadn't quite gotten used to being the reason for it. "You do that on purpose," she said. "Deflect. Every time something real almost slips out, you turn it into a joke." The humor drained slowly from his face, replaced by something more careful. "Would you rather I didn't?" "I'd rather you trusted me enough not to have to." The rain kept drumming. Savel lifted her head from her paws, ears swiveling toward Rarik, watching him the way she watched storms, like she could read the pressure building before it broke. "It isn't about trust," he said finally, quiet now, the performance gone entirely. "It's about what happens to you if you know too much and someone comes looking for it. I've watched danger reach people who did nothing wrong except stand too close to me. I would rather be an insufferable card game tyrant mystery than let that happen to you." Something in Ilyara's chest ached at that, warm and complicated. "That's not your choice to make alone, you know. Whether I'm close enough to be in danger? I got to decide that the night I opened my door. You didn't know what you were opening it to." "No," she agreed. "But I know now that whatever you're hiding, it hasn't made you cruel. It hasn't made you cold. You argue with me about tea and lose every card game with dignity intact, and you look at that wolf like she's the last good thing in the world. Her voice softened further. I don't need the whole truth tonight, Rarek. I just need you to stop pretending the mystery doesn't cost you anything either. He was quiet for a long moment, watching her in the candlelight, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. The look of a man who had spent so long being strategic that honesty felt like standing outside without armor. It costs me plenty, he admitted softly. Every day I don't tell you costs me something. I just haven't decided yet if the cost is worth what I'd risk by paying it. That's fair, she said, and meant it, though her heart ached with wanting anyway. I can wait. Why? The question came out rough, almost bewildered. Why wait for a man who won't even give you his whole name? Ilyara considered the question seriously, turning her cup between her palms. Because my husband gave me his whole name on the day we married, and I still buried him not knowing half of what was in his heart. Names aren't the thing I'm short on trust for, Rarek. It's people showing up. And you've shown up every single day, choosing to be kind even when you're exhausted, even when you're in pain, even when a fence post is actively humiliating you. A small smile tugged at her mouth. That tells me more than any name could. He laughed, short and startled, blinking hard like he was fighting something back. You're going to be the end of me, Ilyara Vansk? Good, she said, smiling properly now. Someone should be. Savil, from her spot by the fire, let out a long, contented sigh and shifted her weight, the rounded curve of her belly catching the firelight. Rarek's gaze moved to her instantly, the reflex of a man who never stopped watching over what he loved, and something tender crossed his face. She's due to whelp before the thaw, he said quietly. I need her safe before then. Whatever else happens, whatever I have to face when I leave this house, I need to know she'll still be here, breathing, when it's her time. She will be, Ilyara said, with a certainty that surprised even her. I'll see to it myself. You don't even know what she is. I know she matters to you. That's enough of a reason for me. Rarek looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Decision-making, she realized, watching a man weigh a risk he'd been circling for days. Her name means more than you know, he said slowly. Where I come from, they call her the tide bearer. Where she goes, things grow. Where she suffers, things wither. I can't explain all of it tonight, and I won't pretend that's fair to you. But I wanted you to have at least that much. A piece of the truth, freely given, not pried loose. Ilyara's breath caught. It wasn't the whole truth. She could feel the shape of everything still hidden around the edges of it. But it was real, offered without her having to fight for it, and that alone loosened something tight in her chest. Thank you, she said softly. Don't thank me yet. A ghost of his usual humor returned, though quieter now, gentler. You still haven't heard the part where I lose spectacularly at cards again and blame the wolf for distracting me. Savil let out an indignant huff, thumping her tail hard enough to rattle the table, and Ilyara laughed again, the sound filling the small cabin, chasing back the rain and the dark and, for one more night, everything Rarek hadn't yet found the courage to say. Outside, the storm rolled on toward the castle he'd left behind, where a man wearing borrowed grief like a crown was already tightening his grip, and where Bren, alone in a cold corridor, pressed a folded letter into the hand of a rider bound for the lowlands, praying it would reach the king before Cassian's patience ran out. The rider reached the lowlands 2 mornings later, half frozen and half lost, having asked directions from every farmer between the castle road and the tree line without once saying who he served or why. Bren had trained him well. Ilyara found him collapsed against her gate at dawn, mistook him for another emergency entirely, and nearly took a swing at him with the very same wooden spoon she'd once wielded against Rarek before recognizing the folded letter clutched in his fist. sealed with wax pressed by a signet she didn't recognize, but Rarik clearly did the moment she brought it inside. His face went pale reading it. Not frightened, pale. Something colder, older. The look of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. Cassian's tightened his grip on the council, he said finally, voice flat in a way that scared her more than shouting would have. Bren says the coronation's being quietly prepared. Not announced. Prepared, which means he's not waiting for confirmation I'm dead. He's simply proceeding as though I already am. What does that mean for you? It means the window to walk back in and simply reclaim what's mine is closing. Soon it won't be a matter of proving I'm alive. It'll be a matter of proving I still have a right to anything, against a man who's already sitting comfortably in my chair. His jaw tightened. I need more time. Savil needs more time. And I have exactly none to spare. Savil, listening from her spot by the door, let out a low whine and pressed her head against his knee. And something in Rarik's carefully held composure cracked at the contact, his hand sinking into her fur, gripping perhaps a little too hard, like a man holding on to the one solid thing in a room that had started tilting. Ilyara crouched beside him without thinking, her hand finding his free one, and he let her take it, which told her more than any letter could have. "You're not alone in this anymore," she said. "Whatever you need to do, plan, wait, heal, rage at the unfairness of it for an hour, you don't have to do it without someone in the room." He looked at her, something fierce and grateful and frightened all tangled together behind his eyes. "You say that so easily." "It isn't easy. It's just true." Her thumb moved once over his knuckles. "Those aren't the same thing." That evening, needing to move rather than sit with the letter's weight pressing down on the cabin, they walked the tree line together, while Savil trailed a few careful paces behind, sniffing at roots and huffing at squirrels with the offended dignity of someone forced to take things slow for medical reasons. "You've gone quiet," Ilyara observed. "That's new. Usually by now you've invented at least one fake rule and blamed it on ancient tradition. I'm rationing my nonsense. Big week. Very responsible of you. I contain multitudes." He kicked a stone off the path, watching it skitter into the brush. "I keep thinking about him. Cassian. We grew up practically as brothers, shared a tutor, shared a room some summers, shared a truly humiliating incident involving a beehive I will take to my grave." A short, humorless laugh. "I gave him nearly everything I had to give. Titles, trust, my own father's ear when he asked for it. I never once thought to wonder if it was enough for him, because it never occurred to me that anything wouldn't be." "That's not a flaw in you," Ilyara said carefully. "That's generosity being met with someone else's hunger. Those aren't the same currency." "Maybe. Or maybe I was so busy being generous I never noticed him drowning next to me." He shook his head. "I keep trying to hate him properly. Clean hatred would almost be a relief. Instead, I just keep thinking about the boy who cried when his dog died and gave me his last honeycomb because mine fell in the dirt. And I don't know how to reconcile that boy with a man who greased a carriage wheel and let me fall down a ravine." "Maybe you don't have to reconcile them tonight," Ilyara offered. "Maybe you just carry both truths until you're ready to know what to do with them." He looked at her sideways, something almost wondering in his expression. "You keep handing me exactly the thing I need instead of the thing that would be easier to say. Comes with the territory of feeding strange men and their extremely opinionated wolves." A small smile. "I specialize in inconvenient honesty." "I've noticed. It's deeply unfair how much I've come to like it." The words landed between them, quieter than he'd meant them to, and he seemed to hear himself say it a half-second after it left his mouth. She watched the realization cross his face, watched him decide visibly not to take it back. "Rarik." "I know," he said softly. "I know what I'm risking, saying things like that to a woman who deserves a man without a kingdom trying to swallow him whole. I know the timing is catastrophic, I have spent 3 weeks telling myself I'd wait until the danger passed to feel any of this properly, and every single day you've made that promise harder to keep." Ilyara's heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it. "And if I told you the timing didn't matter to me? That I've already spent one lifetime waiting for safety before I let myself feel anything, and it cost me years I'll never get back?" "Then I'd tell you," he said, voice low, rough at the edges, "that you make me want to be reckless in a way I haven't allowed myself since I was young enough not to know better. That every evening you laugh at my terrible jokes, I fall a little further into something I have no business falling into right now, and I can't seem to make myself stop." The space between them had narrowed without either of them quite tracking how, close enough that Ilyara could feel the warmth radiating off him in the cold evening air, could see the flecks of gold in eyes that had gone very serious, very open. "I'm not asking you to stop," she whispered. His hand came up, slow, giving her every chance to step back, and brushed a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Ilyara!" A sharp, urgent bark cut through the moment like a blade. Both of them turned. Savil stood rigid a few yards off, ears pinned back, nose lifted to the wind, every line of her body gone taut with alarm. Rarek's entire posture changed in an instant, humor and softness both burning away, replaced by something sharp and commanding that made Ilyara understand, finally, without needing the whole truth spelled out, exactly what kind of man she'd been falling for. "Someone's on the road," he said quietly, already moving toward Savil, already scanning the tree line with the eyes of a man who had led armies. "Ilyara, get inside. Now." The tender moment shattered, and the night, which had felt so full of possibility only seconds before, turned suddenly, unmistakably dangerous. Ilyara did not go inside. She told herself later that there hadn't been time to think it through. That instinct alone had kept her rooted at the edge of the garden, watching Rarek move toward the tree line with a stillness she'd never seen in him before. Every trace of the warm, teasing man dissolved into something coiled and watchful. But the truth, if she was honest, was simpler. She couldn't make her feet carry her away from him. Not tonight. Not with Savil's hackles raised, and the wind carrying something sharp and unfamiliar through the dark. "Ilyara!" His voice was low, controlled, a command wrapped in quiet urgency. "Inside, please. Not without you. This isn't the moment for... I know exactly what moment this is." She kept her voice steady, though her pulse hammered. "It's the moment where you decide whether you trust me to stand beside you, or whether you'd rather I hide in a cabin while you handle something alone. Again, like you have with everything else since the night you showed up half dead at my door." For half a breath, frustration flickered across his face, and beneath it something else. Something that looked almost like relief that she'd refused to leave. The figure that emerged from the tree line a moment later was not, as Ilyara had braced for, a soldier or an assassin. It was an old man, cloaked and limping, leaning on a walking staff with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who'd traveled far past the point his body wanted to stop. "Bren," Rarek breathed, and the tension bled out of his shoulders so fast Ilyara thought he might actually sway on his feet. "You absolute madman! You walked here?" "Rode, then walked. When the horse threw a shoe 2 miles back and I decided my legs were cheaper to replace than a saddle." Bren's dry, exhausted smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Forgive the theatrics, Your Majesty. I would have sent another letter, but some things are safer said than written." Ilyara's breath caught at the title. "Your Majesty." She looked at Rarek. No, she realized at the king, and watched him brace, waiting for her reaction, some old wound flickering behind his eyes as though he expected her to step back from him now that the truth had a name. She didn't move. "You could have led with that," she said instead, arms crossed, "instead of losing to me at cards for 2 weeks under false pretenses." A surprised laugh burst out of Rarek, sharp with relief, and even Bren's tired mouth twitched. She's magnificent, Bren said. I can see why Saville adopted her. She's terrifying, Rarik corrected. I've been saying it for weeks. No one believes me. Inside, with the fire built back up and Bren settled with broth, he accepted more out of politeness than hunger. The humor drained slowly out of the room, replaced by the weight of what he'd come to say. Cassian's grown careless, Bren said. Careless men grow cruel faster than careful ones. He's begun questioning the guard who found the wreckage. Quietly, through intermediaries, asking whether the bodies were truly confirmed or merely assumed. His eyes flicked to Rarik. He suspects, not certainty, but suspicion in a man already balanced on a throne that isn't his, is a dangerous thing. What does he do with suspicion? He tightens his grip. He's begun moving against the old guard, men loyal to you specifically, reassigning them to distant postings before they can ask inconvenient questions. Bren's jaw tightened, and he's asked, twice now, after Saville, not by name, by rumor. Whether the Tidebearer survived the wreck, whether the old blessing on the harvests still holds. He knows on some level that losing her would be losing more than a friend's grief to manage. He knows what she represents to the land itself. Rarik's hand found Saville's fur, gripping instinctively, and the wolf pressed into his palm as though she could feel exactly how frightened he was pretending not to be. If he finds her... He won't, Ilyara said, before she could stop herself, the words coming out fierce and immediate. Every head in the room turned to her, and she lifted her chin, unashamed. Not while she's under this roof. I don't care what he suspects or how careless he grows. He'll have to come through me first, and I promise you, I fight considerably dirtier than I let on during card games. Bren studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, assessment, and then slowly, approval. I begin to understand why the king has been so reluctant to move on despite every reason to. Bren, I said nothing untoward, Your Majesty, merely an observation. But his eyes were kind when they met Rarik's, and something unspoken passed between the two men, years of trust compressed into a glance. Later, after Bren had been settled onto a pallet by the fire, exhaustion finally claiming him mid-sentence, Rarik stepped outside into the cold, needing air, needing space to hold the shape of everything he'd just heard. Ilyara found him there minutes later, arms wrapped around herself against the chill, and didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, letting the silence do what words couldn't. I keep waiting to feel triumphant, he said finally, voice rough. Bren risked his life crossing half the kingdom to bring me information, which means I'm one step closer to reclaiming everything I've lost. And all I feel is sick, because reclaiming it means walking back into a life that will pull me away from this. He gestured, vaguely, at the cabin, the garden, her. Away from you. You don't know that yet. Don't I? His laugh was hollow. I'm a king, Ilyara. Whatever happens next, whether I win back my throne or lose everything trying, the woman who stands beside a king isn't allowed to be quiet and small and ordinary. She's a target. She's a piece on a board that men like Cassian will happily use against me. I've already gotten one person I love nearly killed by simply existing near me. His eyes flicked, guilty, toward the cabin where Saville slept, curled by the fire. I won't do that to you, too. That's not your decision to make for me, Ilyara said, echoing words she'd said before, though her voice shook now with something raw. I told you once already. I decided the danger was worth it the night I opened my door. That hasn't changed because you finally have a crown to put a name to it. You don't understand what you'd be walking into. Then explain it to me instead of deciding I'm too fragile to hear it. She stepped closer, refusing to let him retreat behind distance the way he retreated behind humor. I have already buried one man I loved because the world decided grief was mine to carry alone, quietly, without complaint. I will not do that twice. If you fall, Rarik, I want to fall beside you, with my eyes open, having chosen it. Not tucked safely away somewhere, wondering forever what I could have done, He looked at her like she'd knocked something loose in his chest, something he'd been holding shut with both hands for weeks. I don't deserve the way you keep choosing me. You don't get to decide that either, she said, softer now, a small, trembling smile breaking through. That's my choice to make, and I'm making it. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the cold forgotten, the danger circling somewhere beyond the tree line forgotten. Nothing existing but the narrow space between them and the truth finally sitting honest and unguarded in the open air. Then, from inside the cabin, Saville let out a long, pointed groan, equal parts discomfort and impatience, as if to remind them both, in her own particular way, that some things could not wait forever, and that the world beyond their small refuge was already moving without them. Bren left before dawn, refusing breakfast, refusing the fresh horse Rarik offered from a coin purse Ilyara hadn't known he was carrying, refusing everything except a small pouch of dried herbs, for the ribs I pretend don't still ache. He hugged Rarik briefly, fiercely, the embrace of two men who'd run out of easy words for what they meant to each other, and disappeared back down the muddy road with the careful, unhurried gait of a man determined not to look like he was running from anything. The cabin felt smaller after he'd gone, quieter, in a way that pressed against Ilyara's ribs. He shouldn't be traveling alone, she said, watching the road long after Bren had vanished around the bend. He insisted, said an old steward wandering the countryside draws less attention than an armed escort would. Rarik's jaw was tight. He's not wrong. That doesn't make it easier to watch him go. Saville whined low in her throat and pressed against his leg, and he sank a hand into her fur automatically, the gesture worn smooth from weeks of repetition. The trouble found them 3 days later, and it did not announce itself with hoofbeats or shouting the way Ilyara had braced for. It came, instead, as a fever. She noticed it first in the dullness of Saville's eyes at breakfast, usually so sharp, so knowing, now half-lidded and glassy. By midday, the great wolf had stopped eating entirely, curled tight in the corner nearest the fire, her breathing gone shallow and quick. She's never been like this, Rarik said, kneeling beside her, voice tight with a fear Ilyara had not heard from him before, not even the night he'd collapsed at her door. Not once, not through everything. Could it be the wound from the crash? Something that never healed right? She healed weeks ago. He stopped, pressing his palm flat against Saville's side, feeling for something Ilyara couldn't name. This is her. What she carries. Something's wrong. Ilyara didn't need to be told twice. She was already moving, pulling every remedy she owned from the shelf, boiling water, tearing clean linens, calling on knowledge she'd built over years of tending sick animals and sicker neighbors. Knowledge that had never once been enough to save her own husband. A fact that clawed up her throat now with vicious, unwelcome timing. "Talk to me," she said, forcing her voice steady as she worked. "What is she to you, really? All of it. No half-truths this time. I can't help what I don't understand." Rarik's hands were shaking. She saw it, the first time she'd ever seen him lose that careful, kingly composure entirely. She's the tide-bearer. Her line has walked beside mine for generations. Not servant, not pet, kin in every way that matters. Where she thrives, the land thrives with her. Harvests, rivers. The health of the realm itself is bound, in some old and stubborn way none of us fully understand, to hers. His voice cracked. What she carries now isn't only precious to me. It's precious to everyone who will ever call that land home. If something happens to her... Nothing is going to happen to her, Ilyara said, with a fierceness that surprised them both. Because we are not going to let it. She worked through the night. Cool cloths, bitter tinctures, the same steady hands that had once, uselessly, tried to keep another life from slipping away. Rarik stayed beside her the entire time, useless in the way frightened men often are, holding Saville's great head in his lap, murmuring things in a language Ilyara didn't recognize, old and lilting, clearly meant for comfort rather than meaning. Near dawn, exhaustion finally cracked him open. "I can't lose her too," he said, voice raw, barely above a whisper. "Everyone I've ever loved gets caught in the wreckage of what I am. My father, worn thin by the crown before it killed him outright. Cassian, twisted into someone I don't recognize by standing too close to my shadow. You, hiding a fugitive king in your home because I was too selfish to keep walking past your door." His hands tightened in Saval's fur. "If she dies because I brought this danger to her doorstep the same way I brought it to yours—" "Stop." Ilyara's voice was sharp, cutting through his spiral before it could finish forming. "You are not the wreckage, Rarek. You are a man who has been carrying an entire kingdom's grief on his back since the moment that carriage wheel broke, and you have not once let it make you cruel. That is not the behavior of a curse. That's the behavior of someone who loves too hard and blames himself too easily." "How can you say that, after everything you've seen fall apart around me? Because I've watched you argue with me about tea. Because I've watched you lose at cards with your dignity somehow intact. Because I've watched you hold that wolf like she's the only good thing you trust the universe not to take from you. And I have never once seen cruelty in it. Only fear, wearing the shape of a man trying desperately not to lose anyone else." Her voice softened, cracking at the edges. "You are allowed to be frightened, Rarek. You don't have to carry this like it's proof of some flaw in you." He looked at her, something in his face breaking open entirely, grief and fear and something achingly tender all tangled together. "I don't know how to be the man you keep insisting I am." "You already are him," she said simply. "I'm just the first person brave enough to say it out loud." Toward morning, Saval's breathing steadied. Color crept back into her eyes. The fever, whatever cruel thing had gripped her, loosened its hold slowly, reluctantly, and by the time the sun cracked pale over the tree line, the great wolf lifted her head enough to nose weakly at Rarek's hand. A small, exhausted gesture that broke something loose in his chest all over again, this time with relief instead of terror. "She's going to be all right," Ilyara whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "This time," Rarek said, and the fear in his voice hadn't fully left, even with the crisis past. "But I don't know what caused it, and until I do, I can't promise it won't happen again." Bren said Cassian's been asking after her by rumor. What if this is connected? What if simply being unsettled, unsafe, far from the land she's bound to? What if that alone is enough to hurt her? Ilyara sat back on her heels, exhaustion and dread tangling together in her chest. "Then we make sure she stays as settled and safe as we can manage, for as long as we can manage it. And if that isn't enough? If the only real cure is ending this, facing Cassian, reclaiming what's mine, so she's no longer hiding from a danger that follows her even here?" Neither of them said the rest of it aloud, but it hung in the room regardless, heavy as smoke. That facing Cassian meant leaving this cabin. That reclaiming a throne meant risking everything, including, perhaps especially, the fragile, impossible thing that had grown between them in the quiet weeks of hiding. Saval, exhausted but alive, let out a long, weary sigh against Rarek's knee, and outside, the pale morning light did nothing at all to make the choice ahead of them feel any less like walking toward a blade. The decision, when it finally came, arrived not as a grand declaration, but over breakfast, in the same small kitchen where they'd argued about tea 100 mornings before. "I have to go back," Rarek said, watching Saval eat with steady appetite for the first time in days. Some of the color returned to her, though her eyes still carried a tiredness that hadn't been there a month ago. Not eventually. Now. Whatever this was, the fever, the unsettling, Bren's letter and Saval's condition both point the same direction. She needs stability. The land needs its bond restored, and Cassian needs to be stopped before careless suspicion turns into something worse. Ilyara set down her cup carefully, forcing her hands not to shake. "Then we go now." "Ilyara, Don't. She held up a hand, cutting off whatever careful, protective argument he'd been building. Don't you dare tell me to stay behind where it's safe. We already had this conversation. I fall beside you with my eyes open, having chosen it. That hasn't changed because the road ahead got harder. He looked at her for a long moment, something helpless and grateful and terrified all at once moving through his expression. You understand what we're walking into. A man who orchestrated my death is currently warming a throne he thinks is his. He has a council believing him grieved and loyal. I'll be arriving with no army, no proof beyond my own face and whatever loyalty Bren has quietly preserved. Then we'll need to be smarter than an army, Ilyara said. Luckily, I've had excellent practice outmaneuvering a stubborn king over card games for weeks. I think I can manage one ambitious consigliere. Despite everything, he laughed, a short disbelieving huff of sound. You cannot possibly be making jokes right now. I absolutely can. It's a documented coping mechanism. Ask Savil. She's seen it up close. The wolf, hearing her name, thumped her tail once against the floor, and Ilyara took it as agreement. Rarik, look at me. He did, and she held his gaze steady. We are going to walk into that castle, and we are going to take back what's yours, and I am not leaving your side to do it. That's not bravery. That's just what happens when you love someone. The word landed between them, unplanned, bigger than either of them had said aloud yet, and for a moment neither of them breathed. Say that again, he said quietly. Which part? You know which part. Ilyara felt heat climb her cheeks, but she didn't look away. I love you, Rarik. I didn't plan on it. I certainly didn't plan on falling for a fugitive king who loses spectacularly at cards and argues with tea like it personally wronged him. But here we are. He crossed the small kitchen in 2 strides, cupped her face in both hands like she was something he still couldn't quite believe was real, and kissed her. Slow, certain, the kind of kiss that answered every unspoken question either of them had been too careful to ask outright. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing unevenly. I love you, he said, rough with feeling. I have from somewhere around the 3rd argument about fence posts, though I was too much of a coward to say it until you said it first. You are, historically, a coward about exactly one thing, Ilyara said, smiling against him. Everything else, you've been remarkably brave. They left 2 days later, once Savil was strong enough to travel and a plan. Thin, imperfect, built mostly on Bren's careful letters and Rarik's knowledge of which guards still remembered their old oaths, had taken rough shape between them. The castle rose out of the mist just past midday, gray stone against a paler sky, and Ilyara felt Rarik go rigid beside her the moment it came into view. Not fear exactly, but the particular tension of a man staring down every version of himself he'd been before the wreckage, weighing whether any of that man still fit. It's smaller than I remembered, he murmured. Or I've simply gotten used to smaller things. Fence posts, card games, a kitchen with 1 chair that wobbles. You can miss the chair and still take back the castle, Ilyara said. The 2 aren't in competition. He huffed a short laugh and reached down to steady his hand against Savil's back, the great wolf walking beside them now with renewed strength, though her eyes stayed watchful, alert to the tension radiating off her king. Bren met them at the servants' gate exactly where his last letter had promised, older looking than he had even weeks before, but his eyes lit with something fierce and relieved at the sight of them. You look terrible, he told Rarik, by way of greeting. Prison beard, farmer's tan. If I didn't know better, I'd assume Cassian's men had gotten to you first. It's called rustic charm, Bren. Some of us cultivate it deliberately. Some of us married exceptional women who taught them the value of a good vegetable garden, Bren said dryly, glancing at Ilyara with something like approval. Cassian addresses the full council within the hour, a ceremony, disguised as a memorial. He intends to formally accept the regency, one careful, grief-soaked step from the crown itself. Then we have exactly 1 hour to decide how loudly I intend to interrupt a funeral for a man who isn't dead. Bren's mouth twitched despite the gravity of it all. I've missed your particular sense of timing, Your Majesty. I've missed having somewhere to aim it. Rarek's humor faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by something harder, steadier. The bearing Ilyara had glimpsed only in flashes before now, the shape of the king beneath the exhausted, teasing man she'd nursed back to health. Get me inside, Bren. Quietly, until it isn't quiet anymore. The council chamber, when they reached its heavy doors an hour later, rang with Cassian's voice. Measured, mournful, pitched exactly right for a man performing grief he'd rehearsed for weeks. And so, in the absence of confirmed survival, and in service to the stability our people deserve in this difficult season, I humbly accept the burden the council has. The doors burst open. Every head in the chamber turned. Cassian's carefully composed grief cracked wide open into something raw and disbelieving the instant his eyes found Rarek standing in the doorway, dust-streaked, thinner than he'd been, but unmistakably, undeniably alive. With a pregnant silver wolf at his side, and a woman gripping his hand like she had no intention of ever letting go. That's quite a performance, Cassian, Rarek said into the ringing silence, his voice carrying the full, cold weight of a king reclaiming a room. Truly. You should have gone into theater instead of treason. Cassian's face went the color of old ash, and for one long, suspended moment, the entire chamber held its breath. Nobody in the council chamber moved. Cassian stood frozen at the head of the table, one hand still resting on the arm of a chair that was, quite literally, not his to sit in, his mouth working around words that refused to come. Nothing to say? Rarek walked forward slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between them with the unhurried calm of a man who had rehearsed this moment through weeks of pain and fear and stolen laughter in a small kitchen far from here. That's unusual for you. You always had something clever ready. Even as boys, you talked circles around every tutor we shared. Rarek. Cassian's voice cracked on the name, and for one unguarded second, something genuine broke through the shock. Relief, raw and involuntary, the reflex of 30 years of friendship refusing to die as quickly as ambition demanded. You're alive. Try to sound less surprised. The wheels you sabotaged weren't quite thorough enough. Rarek's voice stayed level, but Ilyara, standing close enough to feel the tension radiating off him, heard the tremor underneath it. Not fear, but something rawer. Grief, still fresh, for a friendship he'd already begun mourning even before the confirmation of its betrayal. I want to hear you say it, Cassian, in front of every man at this table who called you loyal. Say what you did. The council members shifted, murmuring, disbelief rippling through the chamber as the shape of the accusation settled over them. Cassian's eyes darted, to the guards near the door, to the council members watching with dawning horror, to Bren standing calm and immovable at Rarek's shoulder. Searching, Ilyara realized, for any exit that didn't end in ruin. You don't understand what it's like, Cassian said finally, voice low, raw, stripped of every rehearsed grief he'd been performing for weeks. Standing beside you your entire life, watching every door open for you before you even knocked. I loved you like a brother, Rarek, and I hated you for it in the exact same breath. Because loving you meant watching myself disappear into your shadow a little more every single year. So you tried to kill me. I told myself I was simply taking what should have been mine eventually anyway. Cassian's composure cracked further, his hands trembling now, decades of buried resentment spilling out faster than he could control. I told myself the realm would barely notice the difference. I told myself a great many things, and none of them made it easier to live with what I'd done the moment I heard that carriage go over the ravine. Something in his voice, genuine, wrecked, entirely unguarded, made Ilyara's chest ache despite everything. She glanced at Rarek and saw the same conflict written across his face. Fury and grief tangled inseparably together. 30 years of brotherhood refusing to simply evaporate because betrayal had entered the room. "I grieved you," Cassian continued, quieter now. "That's the part I can't make sense of, even now. I orchestrated your death and then I grieved you anyway. Every single day? Because some idiot, stubborn part of me never stopped being the boy who cried when your dog died and meant it. That doesn't undo the ravine, Cassian." "I know." His voice broke entirely on the second word. "I know it doesn't. I'm not asking it to." Savil, silent until now, moved forward from Ilyara's side with slow, deliberate steps, until she stood between the two men. Not menacing, but present, an ancient weight settling into the room that made even the council members go quiet. Her eyes fixed on Cassian, steady and unreadable, and for a long moment he simply stared back at her, something like shame washing visibly over his features. "She's the reason it should have worked," he said softly. "I thought, if she died in that crash, the old bond would weaken enough that no one could later claim the land favored you over me. I thought I was being clever." He let out a broken, humorless laugh. "I've never been more wrong about anything." "You nearly cost her everything," Rarik said, voice hardening. "She spent weeks fighting a fever no healer could properly explain, hiding in a cabin because the road wasn't safe enough for what she carries. Whatever grievance you have with me, and I will own my part in never once asking if you were drowning beside me. She never wronged you. She never did anything except exist, faithfully, in service to a bond neither of us fully understands. You tried to end her because she was inconvenient to your ambition." Cassian flinched, the accusation landing with visible weight, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring at Savil with something that looked unmistakably like remorse finally catching up to years of buried resentment. "What happens now?" he asked finally, quiet, resigned. Rarik looked at him for a long moment. Old friend, self-made traitor, a man whose motivations Ilyara understood with an ache she hadn't expected to feel for a villain, because loneliness dressed up as ambition was still, underneath it all, just loneliness. "The council will decide your fate through proper process," Rarik said finally, "not through my personal vengeance. You tried to have me killed, Cassian, and nearly succeeded in killing someone far more innocent than either of us in the process. That has consequences. But I find, even now, I can't make myself want you erased entirely from a life you spent 30 years inside of." His voice roughened. "I hope eventually you find whatever it was you were actually hungry for. I don't think it was ever really the throne." Cassian's composure finally shattered entirely, tears cutting silent tracks through the ash-pale color of his face, and two guards stepped forward at a gesture from Bren, taking him by the arms with a gentleness that surprised Ilyara, given everything. "For what it's worth," Cassian said, voice thick, as they led him toward the door. "I am glad you're alive. Whatever else is true. I am glad, and I hate that gladness doesn't undo a single thing I did to try and prevent it." The doors closed behind him, and the chamber exhaled as one, the tension breaking into a low, disbelieving murmur among the council members, several of whom were already rising, already bowing, already reorganizing their loyalty in real time back toward the man standing very still at the head of the room. Rarik didn't move for a long moment, staring at the closed doors, grief and relief and exhaustion all warring plainly across his face. Ilyara crossed to him without hesitation, slipping her hand into his, and felt him grip it like an anchor. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "Mercy, even now, even after everything." "It doesn't feel like triumph," he admitted, voice rough. "I thought reclaiming this room would feel like triumph." "It will," she said. "Eventually? Right now, it just feels like grief wearing a crown." "Give it time." He looked down at her, something exhausted and tender, an entirely undone moving across his face, and for the first time since they'd walked through those doors, real relief crept into his eyes. "Come home with me," he said softly. Not command, not request, just an offering, plain and open. "Not to the cabin. Here. To whatever this castle becomes once I've had time to remember how to live in it without dreading every corridor." Saville, leaning heavily now against both their legs, let out a long, satisfied sigh, her rounded belly pressing warm against them, and somewhere in the chamber, one of the older council members began, quietly, to clap. A single sound that spread, slowly, into something like the beginning of celebration. "Yes," Ilyara said, smiling through tears she hadn't noticed gathering. "Yes, I'll come home with you." Outside, beyond the tall windows, the sun broke fully through the clouds for the first time in what felt like months, gilding the castle stone's gold, and somewhere deep in the ancient bond between the tide-bearer and the land she guarded, something long strained finally, quietly, began to heal. Spring arrived at the castle the way it hadn't in years, or so the old gardeners kept insisting, wandering the grounds with something like wonder on their weathered faces as flowers pushed up through soil that had gone stubbornly gray during the long season of Rarik's absence. Ilyara had learned, over the months since that day in the council chamber, not to question the old bond too closely, only to notice quietly how the land seemed to exhale alongside Saville's own recovering strength, color returning to both in careful, parallel measure. The wedding had been small. By royal standards, Rarik had insisted, over the mild protests of a council eager for spectacle, that he'd already had the only ceremony that mattered, weeks earlier, in a cabin kitchen over spilled tea and an argument about card game rules that didn't exist. The formal vows, when they finally spoke them before the assembled court, were almost an afterthought, a public echo of something that had been true between them since long before either of them had dared name it. "You're smiling like an idiot," Bren had murmured to Rarik at the reception, watching him watch Ilyara across the hall. "I am an idiot. Deeply, thoroughly. I recommend it." Cassian's fate had been decided by the council through the long process Rarik had insisted upon, not execution, which several of the older lords had argued for, but exile from the court and its politics, stripped of title and influence, sent to oversee a distant, quiet outpost far from any seat of power. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Rarik had been honest about that, the night the council's decision was finalized, sitting with Ilyara by the fire in chambers that had slowly, over months, begun to feel like theirs rather than merely his. "I don't know if I've forgiven him," he admitted. "I don't know if I ever fully will. But I couldn't be the kind of king who answers betrayal with the same cruelty that created it. My father built half his legacy on mercy he didn't always feel yet. Perhaps that's simply the job. Choosing better, even when you don't feel better yet." "That sounds like wisdom to me," Ilyara had said, and meant it. A letter had come, months later, from that distant outpost. Short, awkward, clearly rewritten several times before Cassian found words steady enough to send. It didn't ask for anything. It simply said the harvests there had been good this year, better than expected, and that he hoped, wherever Saville was, she was well. Rarik had read it twice, said nothing for a long while, and then folded it carefully into a drawer rather than the fire. Some doors, Ilyara had come to understand, didn't need to be fully closed to be safely left behind. The council, once its initial shock wore thin, had settled into something Ilyara hadn't expected. Genuine fondness for her, unearned in their eyes by birth or title, earned instead by the plain evidence of what she'd done, sheltering a broken king and a failing bond through the hardest weeks either had faced, asking nothing in return beyond honesty. The elders who might once have called her just an Omega widow now called her queen with a warmth that still occasionally caught her off guard, mid-conversation, like sunlight through an unexpected window. She'd gone back once to the clan that exiled her, not for vindication, but because Saville had insisted, in her own particular way, nosing insistently toward the old road until Ilyara understood. The elder Doran, older now and visibly startled to find a queen at his door instead of the quiet exile he remembered, had stammered through an apology Ilyara accepted with more grace than he probably deserved, if only because holding on to that particular grief no longer served her the way it once had. "I don't need you to feel guilty," she'd told him simply. "I need you to remember, the next time someone stands before your council feeling small, that the space you make for people to leave in shame is the same space that lets them come back transformed. Choose to make that space kinder next time." She hadn't expected the words to land the way they clearly did, watching something shift, slow and reluctant, behind the old elder's eyes. Rarik healed too, in his own way. The guardedness that had first hidden his name behind humor slowly softening into something steadier, a man no longer bracing constantly against loss. He still lost, spectacularly and often, at the same ridiculous card games he'd invented that first rainy night, and Ilyara still won more than her fair share by refusing, on principle, to let him invent new rules mid-hand. "You are the single most stubborn woman in this entire kingdom," he told her one evening, months into their marriage, sprawled by the fire in chambers grown warm and familiar, Savel dozing heavily nearby, her belly enormous now, her time clearly near. "You say that like it's a complaint. I say it like the single truest, most grateful thing I know how to say." He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "You gave me back a version of myself I thought that ravine had killed along with everything else. The version who laughs, who trusts, who believes somehow, despite every reason not to, that good things are still possible for a man who's lost as much as I have. You did that yourself," Ilyara said softly. "I just fed you broth and refused to let you win at cards. You did considerably more than that, and you know it." Savel huffed from her spot by the fire, the sound so pointed, so clearly amused, that both of them laughed, the sound filling the chamber the way it had once filled a much smaller kitchen, warm and unguarded and entirely, finally, safe. Outside, the kingdom had begun, slowly, to heal alongside them. Rivers running fuller, harvests promising abundance after seasons of quiet strain, the old bond between the tide-bearer and her land no longer fraying at the edges but settling gradually into something whole again. The people who had once whispered about a cursed king and his missing wolf now spoke instead of a queen who had sheltered them both without asking for anything. And a bond that had survived betrayal, exile, and grief to come out steadier on the other side. Ilyara thought some nights about the woman she'd been in that clan hall, chin raised, shame burning up her neck, told she was worthless because grief hadn't given her what the world demanded of her. She thought about how far that woman had traveled, not toward some grand destiny she'd chased, but simply toward a door she'd chosen to open one ordinary frightened night, because turning someone away in pain had never once occurred to her as an option. That, she'd come to understand, had been the whole of it. Not fate, exactly. Just kindness, offered without conditions, meeting a man who'd never stopped being worth it. Epilogue. A year had passed since the council chamber doors had burst open on a king everyone believed dead. The castle gardens bloomed richer than the old gardeners could remember, and laughter echoed easily now through corridors that had once held nothing but careful, grieving silence. In a sun-warmed corner of the castle grounds, Ilyara sat with her back against smooth stone, watching two silver-furred pups tumble over each other in the grass, yipping with the boundless, clumsy joy of creatures still learning the shape of their own paws. Savel watched over them with the same patient, ancient dignity she'd carried through every hardship, occasionally nosing a wayward pup back from the garden's edge with unmistakable exasperation. "They get that fearlessness from her," Rarik said, settling beside Ilyara, watching the pups with unguarded tenderness. "I was hoping for at least one calm child in this family." You married an Omega who once threatened you with a wooden spoon and argued you into losing at cards for a month straight. I don't think calm was ever on the table. Fair point. He pressed a kiss to her temple, watching the pups chase each other in bright, chaotic circles, the land around them lush and thriving, the old bond fully healed. I used to think happiness was something owed to kings by right of birth. I learned in the smallest kitchen I've ever known that it's something you're given, freely, by someone who chooses you anyway, and something you get to keep choosing every single day after. Ilyara leaned into him, watching the family they'd built stretch out before them in the golden afternoon light, imperfect, hard-won, and entirely, joyfully theirs. Home, she said softly, was never the castle. It was always just this, wherever you are. And in the warm grass beside them, the tide-bearers' pups tumbled on, laughing in the only language they knew, while the land around them flourished, whole and unbroken, exactly as it was always meant to be.